Welcome, fellow cosmic explorers, to another episode of the Cosmic Chronicles Podcast, where imagination meets reality and science fiction comes to life. I am your host, Quinn, and I am joined by my co-host, James.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. We are still on the lookout for sponsors, and I imagine that we will be looking for sponsors for a few months before we finally get everything together. So if you are still interested in sponsoring the Cosmic Chronicles Podcast, you can email us at cosmicchroniclespodcast@gmail.com. And lastly, you can find our podcast wherever you get your podcast, including Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, and all around. Be sure to also subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Now, our topic for today is the horrors of the deep, why the ocean is scary. Now, this is a topic we've always wanted to cover. The ocean is a topic in various works of science fiction, and I would say a sizable number, if not the majority of those works, highlight the fears that are associated with the ocean. The ocean is primal, godly, immortal, and ancient. It is quite literally a consumer of cities, a bringer of death and destruction, and yet it also represents life, rebirth, and renewal. The ocean was mankind's first frontier. The first humans who explored it knew not what they would face. Would the earth stop at the horizon, or did the depths reach out into infinity? And of course, what exactly waited within the ocean's seemingly bottomless depths? From the very first time mankind laid eyes upon the ocean, we have wondered about what mysteries it held. In this episode, we will explore these ideas through the lens of the science fiction that we love.
Why do you think the ocean is scary?
Well, like I said before, I think the ocean represents one of the first primal mysteries that mankind came into contact with. So when I think about early man, there were really two big primal mysteries that we first encountered, two things that invoke this sense of awe. And one of them was the ocean, and the other was the sky, outer space. You know, the sun's a god, the moon's a god, the stars are even divine. The ocean was another one of these things. But to me, the ocean is a lot scarier. So basically, essentially every culture has a god associated with the ocean. And that's because the ocean is very angry. The ocean is a bringer of storms. The ocean is a consumer of cities. The ocean is sometimes coughs up the dead. It's an environment that's completely inhospitable to humans. And there was initially, like I said, a lot of mystery associated with the ocean, and there still is to this very day. But with early mankind, people weren't even sure if the ocean was gonna, like I said, end at the horizon. People thought that maybe if they continued on the ocean, they might just fall off the edge of the earth. There was a lot of uncertainty. So you combine that just inherent uncertainty and this inherent mystery of the ocean with the fact that it is this destructive force of nature, and it's pretty easy to understand why the ocean has always been scary.
So what do you know about the Mariana Trench?
I know that the Mariana Trench is the deepest part of the ocean.
It is.
I know that it is used in the movie Meg.
Yeah, that's where it takes
the big
place.
Shark.
Yeah.
I know that James Cameron, director of Titanic and Avatar, has been to the Mariana Trench, I think. Yeah. And that is the extent of my knowledge, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, it's at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It's a huge, huge crescent, and it's about 7 times the size of the Grand Canyon.
Jesus, huge.
Yeah, so that's about 1,589 miles. And the deepest part is called the Challenger Deep. It's about 7 miles under the ocean in an area called the Hadal Zone, which refers to the Greek god Hades, ruler of the underworld.
Makes perfect sense. It's 7 miles. Jesus.
7 miles deep, yeah. It's called the Challenger Deep because it was discovered by the Challenger expedition It was a mission of scientific discovery in 1875. They were using a weighted rope to record the depths of the ocean. And when they got over the Mariana Trench, they put the rope over. They had no idea what they were over. And they realized that they needed more rope.
They had run out of rope.
They had run out of rope. It was so deep.
That's incredible.
But we didn't actually go down there until 1960. We used a bathyscape. Do you know what that is?
No. What's a bathyscape?
Do you know what a bathysphere is?
No.
Okay, so let's back up. A bathysphere it's like literally a sphere that you can sit inside, and it's attached to a boat on the surface, and they would throw you over the ledge and descend you down into the ocean.
Oh, so it doesn't move itself. It's just like attached to the boat.
It doesn't move itself. No, it's just attached to the boat.
So you basically can go down and watch
and
what's
observe.
happening.
Yeah. So a bathyscape is basically a submarine. It's a free-diving, self-propelled submersible, and it's suspended from a float that's on the surface. The bathyscape that went down to the Mariana Trench was called a Trieste, and it was designed by a scientist named Auguste Piccard.
Oh my God, like in Star Trek Next Generation!
Yeah, actually, that's who Jean-Luc Picard is named after.
Makes perfect
the
sense.
Scientist, yeah. And then his son, Jacques Piccard, was the guy that actually went on the Trieste.
So Jean-Luc Picard designed it.
No, Jean-Luc Picard's the captain of the Enterprise. Auguste Piccard.
Okay.
Auguste Piccard designed this bathyscape, the Trieste, that went down to the Mariana Trench.
So Auguste Piccard designs it, and then his son, Jacques Piccard, is
Piccard
actually the explorer.
was the explorer that went down there.
Very, very interesting.
So on their way down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the window started to crack. So they didn't last very long, but they did get to the bottom. They lasted 20 minutes at the bottom.
That sounds horrifying. And so how long ago was this? What year was this exactly?
Oh, this was in 1960.
1960,
yeah.
Wow.
And they didn't expect to find life when they got down there, but they did. They found pale shrimp and flat flounder-like fish. And then they also described a dark brown diatomaceous ooze, which is kind of like a soft dirt made from fossilized remains of tiny aquatic organisms.
That's like in the movie The Meg.
In the Meg, they find that too, but they like go beneath it, and there's another world.
There's like a Jules Verne situation. There's like it goes further. It goes underneath the diatomaceous ooze. Diatomaceous ooze. And there's like a whole prehistoric ocean thing going down with the megalodon. But the Meg is not a scientific.
I don't think that's how it actually is.
It doesn't pretend to.
I think that is the bottom there.
Yeah. I, for one, would never even consider diving. I would never dive in the ocean, but the idea of diving into something as deep as the Mariana Trench just seems like ludicrous to me. And I do not have that spirit of exploration, I have to say.
Well, these guys did it in the name of science.
In the name of science, and in the 1960s.
The 1960s.
Jesus.
And Jacques Piccard, when he got up, he said, "Here in an instant was the answer the biologists had asked for decades. Could life exist in the greatest depths of the ocean? It could."
Which is incredible because it really kind of probably widened people's idea of the kinds of life that could exist. You know, life always finds a way, to quote Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park. Life adapts to like almost any environment. Every niche on Earth is filled by some form of organism, some form of life, which is why I think the ocean is such good fertile ground for science fiction. You can invent so much, you can speculate on so many things because we really don't know what's at the bottom, and we really don't know what could potentially exist.
So speaking of things that could potentially exist in the ocean, what do you think is in the Bermuda Triangle?
I generally think that the Bermuda Triangle is a fun idea, especially when you're like a young teenager or a kid. But I don't believe that there's actually any evidence that there's anything special about the Bermuda Triangle from the research that I've done in my time. So I don't really think there's anything special about it, unfortunately.
The more I researched, the more I was convinced the Bermuda Triangle is over sensationalized. I mean, thousands of planes regularly fly over the Bermuda Triangle every day. For the amount of traffic the triangle gets, there really isn't anything out of the ordinary. There was a study in 2013 where they identified the world's 10 most dangerous waters for shipping and trade, And the Bermuda Triangle was not among those
Doesn't
waters.
even include... So yeah, if there was something special or paranormal about the Bermuda Triangle, it would be in the top 10, right? If there was a special reason that if planes were going down in this particular region more than often, or if ships were disappearing more than often. Yeah, I generally think that it's just a myth. It's one of those myths that doesn't really amount to much when you do research on it.
Disappearing over the water does not seem like much of a real mystery to me.
Yeah, because it's at the bottom of the ocean.
Right.
Like, we know where it is. We just really
more
can't
aircrafts
get to
actually
it.
disappear over land in North America than they do over the ocean.
That's an interesting fact.
Well, there's a great episode of BBC's Nova. Have you seen that show?
I have seen it, yes.
There's an episode in 1976 called The Case of the Bermuda Triangle.
I have not seen that episode.
Well, you could watch it for free on archive.org. I'll put a link in the description for our viewers. But in the episode, they examined the facts of all these reported mysteries, and for each one, there was a very plausible answer. In most of the stories, they have facts deliberately taken out by sensationalist authors to make the account seem more mysterious, such as reports of there being bad weather, that it was at night, and the Coast Guard had no idea where they were at.
So they're like omitting things.
Omitting facts, to make it seem like, oh, how'd they just vanish out of nowhere?
Which has been a technique
there
of
was a
scam
hurricane
artists for a very long time.
Right. At one point, it's worth the watch for sure. There's one point in the documentary where they're interviewing one of these authors and they're asking him where he got his sources and they're holding up facts to him. And you can visibly see him sweat and gulp as they are comparing his stories to all the facts that they have. So are you afraid of the ocean?
Well, the short answer is yeah. I honestly think that I would rather be in outer space than in a submarine in the ocean. Because I feel like when you're in the ocean, and especially if you're like submerged in the ocean is constantly trying to get in and crush you to death and kill you. And it's completely inhospitable. You can't breathe. And then there's the darkness also to consider. And then there's also the fact that the ocean is full of not only predators, but just all sorts of gigantic swimming things that are so many times larger than you are. Even like whales to me are terrifying. Can you imagine being on a little boat and like just seeing a big whale come by? I've seen Life of Pi and the movie makes it look really fun and cool, but I'm like, it would not be fun to be on a little boat and have a whale jump out of the ocean and do like a little backflip. You'd be freaked out. And I just think everything about the ocean is very horrifying. Just the deepness of it, like I said, the predators, or just the idea that the ocean just sometimes is just very violent and the waves are rushing and it's just like it just feels so unsafe and so dangerous. So yes, I'm terrified of the ocean. I'm not the type of person that's going to go swim in the ocean or go surfing or anything. I'll get on a boat, but I'm not doing much more. And I have gone snorkeling, but it was in very calm waters, and the water wasn't calm. And if it was deeper waters, then I would not have done it. So yeah. Are you afraid of the ocean?
I'm terrified of the ocean.
The only appropriate answer.
When I was a kid, I was in Hawaii with my family, and my aunt and uncles, who were young adults at the time, took me out snorkeling on a beach, and because they heard that there were wild dolphins. They wanted to swim with these dolphins. Well, we ended up swimming a mile out.
Jesus.
I was in 4th grade.
Oh no.
Just hanging on for my dear life on a boogie board, seeing these. We got to see the dolphins, so that was pretty cool. But like the water was so deep, and these dolphins would come right up to you and look at you, and I couldn't help but like think like, okay, which one of these is a shark? Which one of these is a dolphin? And it just scared me shitless. And when we got back to the shore, there were some people that were about to go swim with the dolphins, but they were like, "You guys are really out there? Like, sharks hunt with dolphins."
So maybe you did see a
tiger
shark.
Yeah, so there were definitely 100% there were sharks out there.
So maybe when you were thinking, was that a shark? Maybe it actually was a shark.
Exactly. So like after that, like I never stepped foot in the ocean.
Jesus Christ.
And then another time when I was a kid, I was snorkeling. I was actually the same year. I was snorkeling in a lake with my best friend. And it was only about 10 feet deep. It was murky waters. The sun was shining through. We were looking at little logs and little fish. And we come across this area where there's a bunch of fallen trees. And I'm going down looking at them. And I see what I think is branches or sticks sticking out. But they're antlers, gigantic antlers of this buck dead in the water. And I still have that image in my head of that dead buck.
That is horrifying. Well, you know, coming from the South, I don't have the same fear associated with lakes compared to the ocean, because swimming in lakes is very common in the South. But the idea of finding something dead underwater, to me, is particularly terrifying.
It's scarring.
Like a dead body, because it's like, there's something about the water and feeling connected to the dead thing. I feel like it's touching me if I'm in the same water as it.
Definitely. We didn't get back in after that. We just kind of played in the waves.
That is freaky.
Yeah, and that was one of the last times I ever got into it, like a body of water for a while. Recently, I did go into the ocean, and it was fine for a little bit. But then I decided to swim around the boat and like look out into the ocean, and I could just see where it dropped off into blackness. It was like staring into infinity, and I hated it. I wanted to get back onto the boat.
I've never been that far into the ocean, and I would never go over anything that looks black or dark that I can't see the bottom. See, when I was snorkeling, the entire time I could see the bottom, and I think I could kind of see off way in the distance, that black drop off area, but I knew I was never going to go anywhere near that, because just the thought of being over something so deep just evokes this sense of just pure dread to me. I don't know what's under that water. I don't know what could come out of that water and eat me. So no, thank you. Like when I know that shark attacks and things like that aren't that common, but the fact that they happen is enough for me. And I don't want to be eaten alive by something while also being in water. So I'm going to do whatever I can to minimize it.
The vast majority of the world's oceans remain unexplored. So that's an estimated 80% of the Earth's total area that remains unknown to us. Why do you think this is?
Well, I think the first reason is what we were just talking about, because the ocean is dang scary. People are afraid of the ocean. And two, because the ocean is very, 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 very difficult to explore. People talk about space and pressure in outer space. The pressure in space is zero. The pressure underwater is something like 1,000 times greater than the pressure on land. So like I said earlier, if you're in a submersible or a submarine, the ocean is constantly trying to push its way in. And then we can't dive any deeper than something like 1,000 feet or something like that. I don't even know if we can get exactly that far. But yeah, so the ocean is very inhospitable, and it's very, very difficult to even get deep into the ocean, let alone like really, really like do any type of exploration. And also I think that at this point in time, for whatever reason, humankind has lost a little bit of its exploratory spirit. Yeah, I feel like we went to the moon in 1969, and I feel like since then we've become less curious as a species in a lot of ways. We defund things like NASA. We defund things like exploratory missions and scientific things like this. And that's really a shame. And I think that's part of the reason why the ocean is not as explored as it could be, because those are not the things that we emphasize. Those are the things that the government constantly cuts money from, programs that would be going on scientific missions. So yeah, I think it's the combination of humankind lacking the exploratory spirit that it once had, and also the fact that the ocean is very scary and very difficult to navigate and exist in.
And navigating the ocean is super expensive. We could map the entire bottom of the ocean with sonar, but sonar is such a slow process, and it would cost just as much as sending a rover to Mars, which is like $3 billion.
So it's not happening, exactly.
Yeah, here's another crazy fact. Oceans have an estimated 20 million tons of gold spread throughout the seafloor.
Jesus.
But there's no cost-efficient way of ever retrieving it. Because if we could, that's enough money to give every person on the planet 9 pounds of gold.
But it would cost more to get the gold than it would be worth.
It would cost so much more than it would be worth.
And I also think a final reason that probably the ocean is not as explored as it could be is because I think that people in general have the sense that we already know everything about the ocean. I don't think a lot of people in general understand the fact that we know not almost nothing, but there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge about what's actually at the bottom of the ocean. And there's so many organisms and life forms that we have yet to discover. So I think that's part of the reason why it's not as explored, because there isn't much of a drive to learn.
So when did our fascination with telling stories about the ocean begin?
I think it began at the dawn of mankind, the first time we laid eyes on the ocean and the first time we considered its primal mystery, because it's just perfect ground for speculation and for myth making. Because, like I said, the ocean is angry. The ocean is dark. It seems to be immortal. It seems to go on forever. And what the ancient world was best at was creating gods. Every force of nature has a god associated with it. And in just about every culture, the ocean has a god or goddesses associated with it, sometimes several. So we've always been making stories about the ocean, because it was one of the first mysteries that we encountered. And it was always fertile ground for those types of stories. The ocean represents the end of the human realm, or one of the ends of the human realm. So you have the forest, which in a lot of mythologies represents the end of civilization. You have the sky, which represents the end of the earthly realm and the beginning of the heavens. And then you, of course, have the ocean. I think the ocean has so many qualities that would have seemed worship worthy to ancient humans. The ocean is a bringer of life. Seafood and fish come out of the ocean. And the ocean is also a bringer of death. It will literally drown you. It will take your soul. It will take your life force. The ocean is unforgiving. When it gets angry, your village might get destroyed. Your home might be totally flooded. And in the ancient world, because they really didn't have a scientific method, stories were all they had to explain the world and everything that was going on around them. Ancient people wrote stories about things that impacted their day-to-day lives. That's why they wrote stories about the sun and the forest and the ocean.
You talk about the unforgiving power of the ocean and how it consumes cities. What do you know about Atlantis?
I know that Atlantis is one of the most famous myths that exist. I know that supposedly in some stories it was around Antarctica. I know that it was an ancient city that sunk beneath the ocean. And I know that the defining characteristic that makes it distinct from other ancient cities that might have been real or mythological is the fact that it was very advanced in its technology, way more advanced for a city of its supposed time of existing. And that's basically the extent of my knowledge.
I think something that's interesting to know about Atlantis is that the primary and only source we have are from two of Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. So every other mention of Atlantis is only a reference to this.
So there are no historically accurate mentions of Atlantis
There's no independent sources besides Plato. Mm-hmm. And Plato never claimed that Atlantis was a real place in history. It's just something that a character in his dialogue talks about.
Because like we said, there are sunken cities that exist, real sunken cities that have sunk into the ocean.
Right.
But none of them that were super advanced.
So there might be some truth to it. He might be talking about something that he heard about. But as for Atlantis, even Aristotle, who is Plato's student, has said that Plato made Atlantis up for his own philosophizing purposes. Mm-hmm. So it's most likely a fictional civilization invented by Plato, loosely based on real events. And I think he uses it as like an antithesis of Athens, or his version of the ideal state.
Yeah, of course, Atlantis probably had characteristics of a bunch of different cities that existed, because like you said, Plato was drawing from what he knew and things that he had seen, not necessarily talking about something.
True. But also Plato is describing this utopian civilization that possessed technology greater than his own. And this is one of the reasons why people have always been fascinated by this lost continent. It's kind of like a very primitive sci-fi story.
It's like one of the earliest sci-fi stories, kind of. And also sci-fi, like I always say, it always relates to something inherent about humanity, or it always is trying to teach a lesson about humanity. And I think that when it comes to the Atlantis story, or at least the way the myth has developed over the centuries, I think that human hubris is always associated with the myth of Atlantis. So you have this very advanced civilization that kind of got too big for their own britches, and through their hubris, they destroy themselves. Is generally the idea that I tend to see. In Plato's original version, apparently they were cursed by gods or they were forsaken by the gods, but generally they are punished for hubris, is the general idea. And that is a concept that we, of course, see in science fiction books constantly. Like, we invent some technology that ultimately ends up destroying us because we didn't handle it properly. So I think that's a pretty cool observation.
Well, there's a great essay that I read about where the myth of Atlantis comes from. It's called Another Look at Atlantis by Willie Ley. It's from an old science fiction magazine in the 1960s called Galaxy Science Fiction. Though this is an essay, it's not fiction. It's rather research on how the idea of Atlantis came about. And I'll put a link to that article in the description.
So, James, what are some of the earliest examples of science fiction exploring the mysteries of the ocean?
Well, one of the most famous early examples is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Jules
by
Verne.
Jules Verne, yeah. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was originally serialized in 1869. So a chapter of it came out every other week.
That kind of explains why it's written the way it is when you read it. It's very section by section by section, each one like an adventure.
Right. And there's lots of cliffhangers at the end of each chapter as well.
Because it wants you to wait for next week.
It wants you to wait for next week. Yeah. So I actually read this book recently when we knew we were going to do this podcast, because I had never read it.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people read this as a kid. So I went into this as an adult, and it surprised me because I didn't really know what it was about. I had a vague impression that, it's a submarine, and I think they're trying to escape a giant squid.
I had an illustrated copy when I was a kid.
Yeah. And I thought that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea meant the depth, but it actually refers to the distance that they travel while under the sea.
Yes.
So the original French title directly translates to 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas.
Mm-hmm.
And in English, they translated it to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which kind of implies that they're 20,000 leagues at the bottom of the sea.
Which is impossible.
That would be 60,000 miles under the sea. The ocean is not that deep.
Exist.
So the deepest part we already talked about is 7 miles deep.
Yeah.
So 20,000 leagues under the seas, because it's about the distance that they travel. So the book starts out with this great mystery. There's this beast in the ocean that's sinking ships with a pointed tip. So everybody thinks that there's this killer narwhal out in the ocean, and they set out to kill it. And when they find it, they try to harpoon it, and clink, it ends up being metal. It ends up being a submarine. So I imagine the people that were reading this week by week, because I don't think it's revealed until chapter 4 that what they find is actually a submarine, not an animal.
Mm-hmm.
I bet you that was quite the twist back in 1869.
And it is the submarine of none other than
Captain Nemo.
Captain Nemo.
And the submarine's called the Nautilus.
The Nautilus.
Yeah.
Now, both Captain Nemo and the Nautilus have been referenced in so much popular fiction. I'm sure you've heard those names before, even if you've never read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So what's interesting about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is that it's operating on archaic assumptions of science to make kind of things happen, to make things work. You know, like the way Jules Verne kind of, I think, understood the ocean and understood technology that could explore the ocean is different from what would be scientifically accurate today. And yet he did make some seemingly accurate predictions about certain things.
Right. Like the idea of a large, durable, and heavily weaponized submarine seemed completely far-fetched when it was written. But his vision of a ship running entirely on electrical power came true during the implementation of naval submarines in the 20th century. He also describes a weapon called the Leyden ball, which is a bullet of glass and steel charged with electricity. And we have a similar device now, but it functions on land and it's a non-lethal weapon. It shoots electrified rounds, kind of like a stun gun.
And then there's also the giant squid.
The giant squid.
Which isn't really technology. And of course, Jules Verne wasn't the first person ever to be like, a colossal squid exists. But I definitely think that he popularized that idea with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And the colossal squid turned out to be real. It's something that we discovered within the last, I think, 20 years. So the colossal squid is absolutely a real thing. But we very, very, very rarely see them, because they're all the way at the bottom of the ocean. And when we do see them, they're usually sick and dying. So the best footage that we actually have of a colossal squid is very close to the surface, and you can visibly see that it is in the process of dying because they rarely ever surface.
Some people point to 20,000 Leagues as the book that may have sparked the ecological movement, because when it was published, oceans were viewed as limitless supplies of bounty. Like in the 19th century, several species of whales were nearly driven to extinction because of the whaling industry. But throughout the book, the ocean is described as having an intricate balance of marine life. It gives an appreciation for the complexity of the ocean ecosystem.
This is why I love science fiction and science fiction authors, because they're constantly changing the way the world sees things. What Jules Verne did with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea reminds me of what happened with Frank Herbert's Dune, although it's to a lesser degree with Dune, because Dune definitely inspired this whole ecological movement in science fiction and definitely started a wave of people thinking about ecology in the 1960s, almost 100 years after Jules Verne. I just think it's really interesting that two science fiction authors 100 years apart can do something similar through their fiction work. So one of our favorite quotes from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is a quote that Captain Nemo says, "The sea does not belong to tyrants. On its surface, they can still stake their evil claims, battle each other, devour each other, haul every earthly horror. But 30 feet below sea level, their power ceases, their influence fades, their domination vanishes. Ah, sir, live in the heart of the seas. Here alone do I find independence. Here I recognize no superiors. Here I am free." And I just think it's a great quote that kind of like speaks to who Captain Nemo is as a character. And he is a character that Jules Verne develops in a later book, right?
Yeah. There's actually a sequel to the book called The Mysterious Island, and it reveals more about Captain Nemo. In this book, there's people stranded on an island, and they find out that the mysterious island they're on is actually Captain Nemo's hideout, and it's the home port of the Nautilus. In this book, he's on his deathbed, and he reveals his true identity. Because in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Captain Nemo is super mysterious. Nobody knows where he came from, what his intentions are. The other characters in the book are his prisoners. And in the end, he ends up killing a bunch of people. So finally in this book, we learn that he is a lost Indian prince of Dakar. And after a failed rebellion, he escaped to a deserted island with 20 of his compatriots, where they built the Nautilus.
So that's a really interesting fact, and I definitely never knew that about Captain Nemo. I never even knew there was a sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So that is a super interesting fact.
I don't think people knew that it was a sequel when it came out either. And it was like a big reveal towards the middle of the book that, oh, this is Captain Nemo, and this is where he's been. And we get to finally know why he did the things that he did.
Interesting. So if you haven't read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I definitely think it's still an interesting read if you are a lover of science fiction.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as an adult. I thought it was a kid's book. I recently read it. But one thing you should know about me is I love old books. So I love the way that it read.
Absolutely. And speaking of old books, let's talk about Lovecraft.
Okay, so why do you think Lovecraft chose the ocean as a backdrop in his vision of Cthulhu?
I think it is pretty freaking obvious. Is because the ocean is big enough and grand enough and deep enough and dark enough and mysterious enough to house something as monstrous and ancient and as eldritch as Cthulhu and the other old ones. Lovecraft was playing on the inherent mystery that already exists, that's already associated with the ocean. The old ones in his story are basically adopting the fear that the ocean evokes. That's a part of the fear that Cthulhu evokes. So it's just an excellent backdrop. And also the ocean is the only example of something that we have in nature that can take something as large as a city. The idea, as we said before, of a sunken city is something that exists. And the ocean is really one of the only things in nature that has the concept of returning something. Things come out of the ocean all the time and return to land. So I think the idea that the ocean can take something and then return it eons later and it can bring devastating consequences is already something that was kind of present in humanity's collective consciousness, and it was fertile ground for Lovecraft to play upon.
So what metaphors can be interpreted from the rise and return of Cthulhu? Or what does Cthulhu represent?
So the thing about Cthulhu is that his return is certain. He is asleep right now. He's waiting at the bottom of the ocean. But one day, when the stars realign themselves, he will awaken, and it's guaranteed whether or not we choose to believe in it. Now, I think that Cthulhu can be seen to represent humanity's fear of something great in the future that is beyond our control. It is the fear that we are not in control of our own destiny, that we are not in control of our own fate, that there are things that move with greater force than we can resist. I think that is the essential fear that the rise of Cthulhu in the story represents, and I think that is the essential fear that Cthulhu represents. The dark judge of mankind.
In the story Call of Cthulhu, there's people that start having visions of Raleigh and Cthulhu. Like, why those specific people? Why were they chosen?
I think there is a very clear implication from the story. And it's basically that these certain individuals were open. They were open in some way, like they were artists. They were open to the ether. They were open to receive this intention. You know, a lot of people think, or there's this idea that all art, that all creativity is pulled from some ethereal realm, and you have to be open to receive, you know, the gift, the blessing of like this knowledge. You have to be open. It's you know, the ancient idea of a muse. You know what I mean? So you're open to the intention. And so I think that's why the certain people freaked out. It was people that were available. You know what I mean? People that were open to be influenced by the thoughts of the old ones. Because the old one, the book mentions that the old one's language was not a language that we could really comprehend. It was a language of thought. It was kind of like a psionic language that was transmitted in a way that we really didn't understand.
So why does the ocean cut off the old ones from these people's dreams?
I think that is Lovecraft paying homage to the power and the spiritual force of the ocean itself. I don't remember the exact quote, but in the Call of Cthulhu, it says something like the primal mystery of the ocean cut off the spectral intercourse. For whatever reason, the psionic power, that thought energy that the old ones were sending off to communicate with mankind, the ocean blocked it. And I just really think that's homage. I really think that is Lovecraft paying homage to the power of the ocean and recognizing that the ocean has something greater than even the old ones can check. Well, because and that is aligned with the rest of his mythos, because we know that the old ones are subject to the forces of nature. They can only move between the stars when the stars are aligned properly. And I guess something similar applied to the ocean.
Well, that's interesting because radio waves we use all the time. They can be used to explore space, but they don't work in the ocean. The water gets in the way.
That's interesting, and this might be kind of loose because we talk about the predictive power of science fiction, but that's almost there. I guess spectral intercourse of the old ones isn't exactly radio waves, but you can see kind of the connection there. That's a funny fact.
So why did Raleigh sink to the bottom of the ocean? And how did it rise back up?
The heavy implication in the book is that it had to do with the alignment of the stars. The old ones are heavily subject to the alignment of the stars. When the stars are right, they can leap boundless between the stars. And when the stars are wrong, they are imprisoned and they become beings that can only communicate through thought. So it was the alignment of the stars. And for whatever reason, something happened in the cosmic alignment and the stars were in the right alignment for a very brief amount of time in the story, and then maybe came out of alignment. So Cthulhu wasn't awake. He was only awake for several hours instead of like for a new eternity. So yeah, that's essentially the basic reason. And of course, Lovecraft is a little vague with some of the things. He doesn't want to give you too much. But if I had to speculate as to a reason, it seems that the text heavily implies that.
Do you think it's possible that Raleigh might be an ancient spaceship?
That's a cool concept. Well, it does say that the old ones came from outer space, the outer cosmos, And it also does say that they brought things with them. Like it says they brought their images with them, and they brought like strange metals and things with them. So could Raleigh be a spaceship? It very well could, because where did the metal come from? Anywhere. Where the material come from? And then Raleigh is mentioned to have all these strange angles and to be like really weird, and you turn a corner and then it doesn't make sense. It's just like it's a very weird kind of like brutalist structure. I don't even know if brutalist is the right word, but it's just a very weird structure that doesn't make sense.
He uses the term non-Euclidean.
Non-Euclidean is the term he uses in the book. So it is a very alien structure. So the idea that it is a spaceship is an interesting concept, because where did it come from?
Now, is Cthulhu even concerned with human affairs at all?
No, not particularly. It's kind of like, if they're there, he's gonna use them to do what he needs. You know what I mean? He's not really concerned. But I mean, are humans really concerned with any of the organisms or things that we make use of without really thinking about it? It's like that, I think. Are you concerned with the blade of grass? We grow it still. You're not that concerned. You don't care about the blade of grass really as an individual. So I don't really think he's not really concerned, no. The old ones, the ancient beings, their motives can be assumed to be far more complex than we can even comprehend. What Cthulhu wants and what Cthulhu's actually doing is beyond us. In the story, he's called something like the Great Priest or the Great Sorcerer or something like that. He casts spells that cause some kind of change or effect on the universe that's incomprehensible to us as mankind. And I think that's a part of it. That's part of what makes it scary. And we don't get to know exactly what's going on with Cthulhu and what he's actually thinking about.
So then what is Cthulhu?
So what is Cthulhu? And I feel like we've been talking about Cthulhu for a while without really explaining what he is. So Cthulhu is one of the great old ones, and in Lovecraft's work, there are several beings, an uncounted number of beings that have existed for eons and eons and eons and eons and eons. And the cosmos is their domain, and they are the beings and the forces that rule the cosmos. And because the cosmos is so big and so diverse, we rarely ever see them, but they are still here, and they're sometimes in other dimensions. And Cthulhu is one of such beings that waits on Earth, and he has been here long before the domain of mankind. Right? He was the first ruler of Earth. The old ones were the first rulers of Earth. So long before we were even thought about, he was there, and he waited. So that's the concept of Cthulhu, and he's from somewhere in space initially, as I said. So that's what he is. Like I don't know what is he made of physically. That's an interesting question, because in the novel, in the short story, there's a part where a ship moves through Cthulhu and his body reforms together, almost like he's made of like something like gelatinous, almost like he doesn't exist in flesh and blood the way that we exist. He's something else. He's something that almost we can't even begin to conceptualize or understand. Like we could never kill Cthulhu with a bomb or an explosion, like in the movie Underwater. Well, we don't know if he dies, but we could never like attack Cthulhu like with mortal technology.
So Lovecraft has another story in the Cthulhu mythos called Shadow over Innsmouth, where he introduces these aquatic creatures come from the ocean called the Deep Ones.
The Deep Ones.
What are the Deep Ones?
Well, the Deep Ones are these creatures that live in the ocean. They are not old ones, but there are several beings in Lovecraft's mythos that aren't quite old ones, but they are beings that know of old ones or worshipped old ones, just like twisted creatures. And they sometimes come out of the ocean and breed with humans and get up to shenanigans. And they worship Dagon, an eldritch horror that exists in the ocean. So that is basically the deal with the Deep Ones. And the Deep Ones have been, I think they've been referenced more outside of Lovecraft than they actually were within Lovecraft's mythos. George R. R. Martin has Deep Ones in his stories. He calls them the Squishers in the Song of Ice and Fire books. The idea of the Deep Ones has just been used in a lot of places.
So what fear do you think the Deep Ones represent?
Well, in Lovecraft stories, I think the deep ones represent a very specific fear that comes out of one of Lovecraft's, I think, personal flaws. And it's the fear of tainted bloodline. So in Shadow over Innsmouth, the big twist is that the main character, spoiler alert, is part deep one. And he's beginning his transformation to become a deep one. And that's one of the tropes in Lovecraft's mythos, is tainted bloodline. A character has this tainted ancestry. And I think that might have come out of Lovecraft's xenophobia, or because we do know that he was a very xenophobic person. I mean, we can separate the art from the artist, but to some degree it does seep in. I think it in part does come from that place, but I do also think that it is an effective tool for horror. You know, the idea that you're part squisher, the idea that you're part monster. And the deep ones also represent a fear that I actually talked about in my last Halloween special. It's the same fear that created the craze in the mid 1900s of the aliens are coming for our women. The deep ones want to come and take our women and breed and mix with us. So I think at the core, the idea does stem from xenophobia, like at its root. And I don't know if that is, that's not necessarily the root in every manifestation, but at the core, I think that's where that fear comes from. And that's the fear that Lovecraft intended them to represent.
Do you know of any good adaptations of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos?
Good? No. But worth the watch? Okay, Underwater is not a good movie, in my opinion.
Underwater with Kristen Stewart?
With Kristen Stewart. It came out in 2020, I think.
It's not a very good movie.
But what is cool is that there is an awesome looking Cthulhu monster and a bunch of deep ones at the end of it.
Cthulhu, yeah.
And it looks awesome. I mentioned this a little bit earlier because they try to bomb Cthulhu at the end. I'm like, you can't bomb Cthulhu. Give me a break. Cthulhu would eat that explosion. But yeah, like I would say, if you want to watch the whole movie, sure, watch it. But if you want to just if it's streaming somewhere, you want to just skip to the last 20 minutes just so you can see the cool Cthulhu monster, I would say that, because the movie kind of does drag. And if you've seen Alien, then you know this movie already. It's very derivative, I think.
The same premise, but underwater.
Yeah, but it does have that cool Cthulhu monster. And I really wish there was. I actually think that Cthulhu, more than a lot of other Lovecraft stories, would lend itself to adaptation very, very well. The way it's written, it could be a great miniseries.
What would a good adaptation of that look like?
Well, I think you would start off the same way that you do in the story. You would have the main character going through his uncle's things, and then every episode can be one of the things that he's reading about, because he reads about several different events that involve this cult and that involve Cthulhu. So each episode, 3 or 4 episodes, can be one of those events, and then him going in and out thinking about things. And I think that would work very effectively. I think there's a lot of mystery in that story. I think it's just a very well written story. It's definitely very talked about for a reason. Not only is Cthulhu very interesting, I think that Call of Cthulhu is probably Lovecraft's best short story. I really do think it is. So yeah, I think if you structure it right, make it a miniseries, I think that could really, really work. And also that just so many great scenes that would just work so well on screen. The cult scene when you got the cops going through the jungle and finding the cult, when they're interviewing the cult members, just all of it, just the flashbacks to the archaeological society. I think it would really work as a miniseries. So HBO, get on that. So let's talk about some of the concepts found in science fiction surrounding the potential of underwater exploration, survival, and technology, and the potential benefits and problems that could arise.
So why would humans build a society under the sea?
Cool question. So actually, one of my favorite graphic novels ever by Rick Remender and Greg Tuccini, Low, deals with this very idea. And in Low, the sun has gotten very, very big. It's expanding and the earth has become very hot. So humans have migrated to under the ocean and they live in these big domes. And it's just a great graphic novel, and it's really cool. So I think if the Earth was damaged in some way, or if the Earth got too hot, it's probably completely impractical. Probably no real reason that we would ever do that. We probably go to a different planet before we develop the technology to live at the bottom of the ocean.
Well, in Low, they can't get to another planet. That technology doesn't exist yet. Or it does exist, but they haven't found a suitable planet.
They haven't found the planet.
So they're waiting underwater until they can.
But also in Low, I think Low is very fantastical, and it's not meant to really make real scientific sense. It's very like fantastical. It is science fiction, but it's not hard science fiction by any means. Like we have people like in diving suits at the bottom of the ocean where the pressure would totally crush them.
Could not work.
But yeah, I think it's still a very good series, and it's about family, and it's about hope, and it's about perseverance, the perseverance of the human spirit. It's about what keeps us going, and it's about like what connects us as human beings. And I think that it's probably a masterpiece, and I feel like it's so underrated that I promote it whenever I can.
So speaking of Low, do you think there would be any social or psychological challenges people will face living underwater, isolated from the world above?
Absolutely. And that's definitely something that Low goes into. I mean, we evolved on the surface. That's who we are. So like isolated in these shells underwater, I think that humankind loses a part of its spirit, its inherent soul. And we see in Low that these domes show all the signs of a dying society. And that's also because their society is literally dying. Like there's technical filtration problems with their air system. But like still, I think that just not seeing the sun would fundamentally change who we are as people. And a few science fiction things deal with this concept. You know, we got like Silo, based on the series Wool. And then we've got the City of Ember, which was one of my favorites growing up. Which was about these people that lived underground. They had been down there for like hundreds of years, and they had never seen the sun. And although they don't know it, there is something that they've lost. There's something that's missing. We evolved to be under the sun. So I just think inherently by being under the ocean, we do lose something, if that was ever something that happened.
How do you think being underwater would differ from the isolation of being in space?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, I feel like the ocean, the pressure, I feel like you could almost feel the pressure of the water trying to get in. You know what I mean? There's something about space to me where I'm nowhere near as afraid of being in outer space than being in ocean. I would rather be in like a Sandra Bullock gravity situation than being stranded underwater. There's something so devastating and dark about the ocean. It feels so enclosed and claustrophobic. Whereas space feels very open. It feels like I'm looking out into endless possibilities. I'm floating in the heavens. Whereas like being underwater feels like I'm in the underworld. It feels like I'm trapped, contained at the bottom of all existence, at the lowest level of reality. So I don't know. Maybe that's just a psychological feeling in my mind, but that's the feeling that I get.
So there's a book I read that kind of goes into all this called Starfish by Peter Watts. Have you read that one?
I have not, but I have read Blind Sight and Echopraxia.
Yeah, you've done some videos on some Peter Watts books. Yeah. Well, this is kind of similar to Blind Sight. Starfish, it's set underwater in a deep ocean power station, and they're harvesting energy from a geothermal vent along a tectonic shift. And what's interesting about it is this place is staffed by people who have been radically adapted for deep sea labor, so they can swim and breathe underwater and survive immense pressure. And they call these people rifters.
Weird.
It is weird. And the corporation that has this power station, they find out that people tend to go insane from the isolation of being miles underwater.
Evil
so
corp.
They specifically select people who are used to being under stress and who have been through trauma so that they can easily adapt.
Pretty screwed up, honestly.
Right. So, I mean, I think there's like 12 characters under there, and they're all have very strong personalities, and it's about what they find down there and how they interact with each other. It's about a lot of things, like all of his books, but it takes place underwater. And Peter Watts actually made this series available for free on his website.
Ah, well, I love Peter Watts, so I'm definitely going to probably be picking that up because I really enjoyed the other two books of his that I read. And I do like underwater stuff. I think underwater stuff can be very scary, so I'm going to check that one out.
So do you think intelligent life can exist underwater? And what might that look like?
Well, do I think that intelligent life could have already evolved under? It's two questions, right?
Sure.
So I think intelligent life already exists underwater. Do I think it could exist underwater in the future? So do I think there's already evolved intelligent life underwater? Oh no, maybe. I just saw a documentary about people trying to talk to whales.
Oh yeah.
And that was pretty interesting, even though the documentary wasn't that great. But the
Fathom.
idea,
It's on Apple
Fathom.
TV. Yeah.
The idea of people talking to whales, the idea that these creatures could have potentially complex speech. And I think that we're egomaniacs as humans. Like we are like, of course they couldn't have complex language. Maybe they do. Maybe we just don't understand it. Maybe they don't feel the need to try and communicate with us. So maybe. And like I said, the ocean is really, really deep and we don't know what's totally in there. So maybe there are intelligent things in the ocean. Second part of the question. Could we like create life that goes in the ocean through like bioengineering and stuff like that? Like in the movie Deep Blue Sea, where we put like a human brain inside of a shark? Potentially. I feel like when it comes to genetic engineering, that's a new frontier of science. And I think that's going to be a very weird thing. I feel like a lot of us are hyper focused on like AI and aliens when genetic engineering is going to be like a weird thing that totally changes the future of humanity. So we might be having fish humans that live in the ocean before long.
Have you heard of aquatic ape theory?
I have heard of aquatic ape theory, but tell me about it.
Well, when I was a kid, there was this, what I thought was a documentary. I was flipping through channels. This was before Netflix. And I just came across in the middle of this documentary called Mermaids, The Body Found. And it was like on Animal Planet or National Geographic. I thought
I saw that
it was real. I thought it was real that I
totally
posted
got
on
tricked by that.
Facebook and I told everyone, I was like, magic exists. You have to watch this documentary. Everything's about to change. Turns out I had to delete that post, but it's a fake documentary. But the theory that they use in that documentary, aquatic ape theory is a real theory, but
hypothesis.
It's not. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. You're right. You're right. So like people have talked about this before. It's the idea that there's a species of ape that went back into the ocean and evolved to live in the sea, kind of like a mermaid.
So like as we like evolved to like live on land, they like kind of like went in reverse and evolved to like live in the water, and they developed like fins and gills.
They went back to their roots. There are species that have done that. Like I'm pretty sure whales and whales for sure used to be wolves.
Yes,
I know that.
Yeah. Platypuses are super weird too. They're like some weird hybrid. They lay eggs and they're very bizarre.
Well, if aquatic ape theory is true, they probably wouldn't look like mermaids. In fact, the manatee is probably more what apes would look like if they evolved back into the ocean.
Interesting. So we have the idea of mermaids like Ariel, the Little Mermaid, or like Daryl Hannah and Splash. But I've always thought that if we had real mermaids, they'd look more like the ones in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the movie, because those things look like they evolved in water. They don't really look like people with tails. They've kind of got more like shark tails almost, which makes more sense than I think the flippy whale looking tail that Ariel, the Little Mermaid, has. So yeah, that's kind of what I've imagined them like. And that's kind of what they look like in that fake documentary, The Bodies Found or whatever it was called, that I totally got tricked by as well. So yeah.
Do you think it would be easier or harder to find commonalities with intelligent creatures from the ocean compared to ones we might find in space?
Well, really, there's no telling. But in general, I would say it'll be easier to communicate with creatures from the ocean because we would have the same evolutionary tree, right? Whereas like things from space, they could be very, very different from us. Very different. Everything on Earth, we assume, everything on Earth, we have a basis of connection to. We share DNA. So immediately there's that, we're on like the same ground. There could be things from outer space that aren't even made of what we're made of. So yeah, I think in general, probably the ocean would be easier.
Well, I just read a great book that just came out called The Mountain and the Sea by Ray Naylor. Have you heard of that one?
I have heard of that one.
Damn,
and
it's
I
good.
follow him on Threads, and he follows me on Threads.
Nice. He should come on the podcast.
He should.
His new book, The Mountain and the Sea, though, is crazy good. It's about a lot of things, but it's mainly about the scientist that is attempting to communicate with intelligent life in the ocean.
Like Fathom.
Yeah, except for in this story, they're octopuses.
Whoa.
Yeah, something as different.
It's not octopi.
Both are correct.
Okay.
Octopuses, octopi, octopods.
Interesting.
Yeah, are
Weird.
all right. But octopi or octopuses, they're like the most alien creatures in the sea.
They're fucking weird.
Right. So this book is about attempting to communicate with this species they find. Like I said, it's about a lot of things. There's one part that takes place on a really creepy boat that's run completely by AI with human slaves. And it's frightening. But I don't want to say too much about the book because I think it's best to go in not knowing too much about it and just experience this world that Ray Naylor has created. I do want to read a quote from it because the prose in this book is just spectacular. "We came from the ocean, and we only survive by carrying salt water with us all our lives, in our blood, in our cells. The sea is our true home. This is why we find the shore so calming. We stand where the waves break, like exiles returning home."
Wow. There definitely is an inherent calming feature of the ocean. Like standing on the shore, it's very calming. And even if the water is kind of rushing, for some reason, being there and standing by the shore is very calming. So that's very true.
But I really think you should read this book and make a Quinn's Ideas video on it.
It's on my list.
There's a lot of concepts. You can make several videos on
It's definitely on my list. And I've already told Ray that I'm going to do it. So yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to read the book because I love anything with octopuses in it, because octopi are they're just weird. And so just
They're
like
alien.
very alien-like.
I've heard people claim that octopuses don't actually originate from Earth.
I've heard that too, which is very weird. And
I don't know about that.
I feel
It's
like
cool
we
to
can
think
test
about.
their DNA. We can test the DNA and probably figure it out.
I'm sure we have.
But they are very alien-like the way they behave.
Right. Like, do you know about the octopus brain?
No, what's up with the octopus brain?
Okay, so like octopus, they have 8 limbs, and all those limbs operate on a completely independent nervous system.
I did hear that. I did know that.
So they have like a central brain that gives commands, and then each arm decides how to accomplish that task. Like
Jesus
imagine if you're like,
Christ.
oh, I want a cheeseburger right now, and you look over and one of your hands is bringing you a cheeseburger.
Ah,
Yeah.
that's kind of creepy. So if an octopus loses a limb, is that limb like semi-aware of like?
I don't know if it's aware, but like if you chop off an octopus's leg, it like still wiggles around, right?
Around.
Yeah.
Jesus.
And how scientists discovered this is is weird. They severed the nerves in the arms from the central brain and then tickled them.
Ah,
And they felt the tickles.
that's so weird and bizarre and interesting.
Another thing that's alien about octopuses, they have blue blood.
That is super weird.
Yeah, right? So our blood is red because we have hemoglobin, which contains iron, and when it's oxygenated, it turns red. Octopuses have hemocyanin, which is a lot like hemoglobin, but it contains copper. And when copper is exposed to oxygen, it turns blue.
Weird. I feel like a weird fact about octopus, or a cool fact about them, is like how they can kind of squeeze through like almost anything.
They're all muscle. They don't have any bones.
Oh, that is,
Right,
they're
yeah.
so squishy.
That's what makes them
and
so
weird.
strong, too. All their arms are just nothing but muscle.
It makes you wonder how like an organism like this could even exist. Well, I don't think something like this could exist on land, but in water. And that's the funny thing about octopus too, is because they can leave the water. Unlike the majority of sea creatures, they can totally leave the water for a limited amount of time. I mean, not permanently, but they
Right.
can, which is really interesting. I wonder, I'm not a scientist, so I wonder how that feature of the octopuses evolved. Because why were they leaving land? Why do they have that ability? Why do octopuses
Well, I think a
leave
lot
land
of
ever?
octopuses live close to shore. So if the
Mhm.
tide goes out and they're kind of stuck,
I
they
think
have a...
They can scuttle back in if they
yeah.
need to.
that would be my guess. But octopuses can survive in low oxygen because they have 3 hearts. And they have 2 that pump blood to the gills and 1 that pumps blood everywhere else.
Gotta keep those gills oxygenated.
Have you seen any videos of octopuses on YouTube changing colors?
Yeah, I've totally
It's
seen
insane. It's like, how does this happen in nature?
like it's incredible. Like I don't know, and the precision with which they change color is what's impressive to me. It's just so bizarre and weird. It's a phenomenal adaptation, I think. Yeah, octopuses are one of the weirdest animals on the face of the planet.
Another thing that's cool about them are their eyes. Their eyes operate with a single lens that can change shape and adjust to focus. So like imagine instead of having glasses, you can just like squeeze your eyes and focus in on what you want.
Whatever you want.
Yeah. In fact, by studying the octopus's eyes, that's how we came up with better camera technology.
That's a fun fact. Interesting.
Do you know anything about the mating habits of the octopus?
Not really. I know that like some octopus like mothers like literally will like stay with their eggs until they literally die of starvation. But as far as like how they mate, I don't know.
It's hella funny. So male octopi, one of their arms is their sexual organ.
What?
Right. Yeah. So it doubles as an arm and a sexual organ. And they use that to fertilize the eggs. Though the majority of the time, the male octopus doesn't really want to be around the female octopi because they're very solitary creatures. Mm-hmm. So they will rip off their arm and give it to a female.
It's like, here you go.
And the female will hold on to it and keep it for as long as she needs. And then when she's ready, she'll fertilize her eggs with it.
There's weirder shit in the ocean, honestly. I mean, there's like that species of fish where the male will attach itself to the female and it'll just merge into its body and it'll just be like a permanent supply of sperm. There's so much weird stuff in the ocean. Yeah, well, that's bizarre.
But the craziest thing about the octopus is that it uses tools. There have been some species of octopuses that have been observed using coconut halves as armor, which is really strange for an animal to do because when it picks up the coconuts, there isn't an immediate advantage, you know? It's more of a burden to carry around these coconuts. So just the fact that they are collecting objects for future use is a sign of great intelligence.
That's so interesting because people tend to think that tool use is the domain of humanity and humanity alone. But this is kind of saying that it's not. I mean, we're still, I guess, the only species that creates tools, but tool use is not our domain alone.
So yeah, the octopus, they're the alien of the sea.
Those alien octopuses.
So what do you think is hiding in the depths of the ocean?
We can't say, but certainly I'm not going to be the one to find out. I'll leave that to people that are braver than me. I think there's a lot of darkness. I think there's probably several species of things that we've yet to uncover. There's probably a bunch of sunken cities and sunken ships and a bunch of lost history. Probably not Cthulhu. At least I don't want there to be a Cthulhu.
Cthulhu might be there.
Cthulhu might be there.
We have a recording of Cthulhu called the bloop.
The bloop.
Have you heard of the bloop?
I have heard of the bloop. So the bloop was basically a sound that we heard from the ocean that we thought for a long time came from some immense living creature at the bottom of the ocean. And the reason that it's extra creepy is because of the coordinates of it. They're very, very close to where Lovecraft wrote that R'lyeh had sunk into the ocean. So like if you look at on a map where the coordinates of the bloop is and the coordinates of where R'lyeh supposedly was, it's very close. It's almost like, is this the call of Cthulhu? But what do you have about the bloop?
Well, it's not Cthulhu. I'm sad to tell you.
I knew that. But, yeah.
But it was discovered in 1997 by the NOAA, which is kind of like the NASA of the ocean. And it's just an ultra low frequency with high amplitude that they detected underwater. So you can listen to a recording of this that the NOAA released, but it's released at 16 times the speed. That way the human ears can hear it. Let me play it for you.
So it just sounds like a bloop?
It's literally a bloop.
It literally sounds like a bloop?
Now that's 16 times the speed though. People have slowed it down on YouTube and it sounds much more frightening. Let me play just a little bit of that for you.
Yeah, definitely Cthulhu. No question about it. Whatever they say it is, it's not. It's Cthulhu. The government found it, and they know where Relay is, and they're freaking out about it. And
Well,
everything else is a distraction. It's Cthulhu. We have the evidence. What do you mean?
no. The only reason that people think that it's a creature is because a scientist from the NOAA was doing an interview, and he said that he did not believe the bloop to be man-made. And then he goes on to say that it shared a similar audio profile to that of a living creature.
You have it. You got it. Creature. Living creature.
However, the sound of it is much more powerful than any known creature.
Yeah, they got it. It's the biggest living creature ever. Cthulhu.
But people hyper-focus on that sentence because immediately after he attributes the sound to ice calving in Antarctica, like an ice quake. And they have discovered that the sound did emanate from an iceberg cracking and breaking away from an Antarctic glacier.
So essentially, he basically said that it sounds like a living creature, but there's nothing that big that could make that sound. So it's probably just cracking sea ice. And then later they confirmed that it was cracking sea ice.
Yes. But if you want to believe it's Cthulhu, that's a lot of fun. That's fine.
It's just, I totally get why it caused so much hubbub in the H.P. Lovecraft community at the time because of like the location of it and because of like, especially what the slowed down version of it sounds like. The bloop is a really interesting event, a really interesting thing that occurred. Yeah, but in all seriousness, hopefully Cthulhu is not at the bottom of the ocean. But you know what is hiding at the bottom of the ocean? Maybe we'll never know. And I, for one, I would rather look to the stars than look to the ocean. I know the ocean is important. I know the mysteries of our planet are important. But at my core, like, I am a Star Trek fan. I am a fan of the idea of space exploration. It's what gets me very excited. I want to see the stars. The ocean scares me. The stars excite me. So thanks for listening to the Cosmic Chronicles Podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or wherever you listen to your podcast. We also have a YouTube channel that you can check out. And don't forget, new episodes every other Friday. Thanks so much for listening.